spoke Jesus to the multitude and to his disciples, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore, whatever they bid you observe and do. But do not after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. But all their works they do to be seen of men. They make broad their phylacteries, and enlarge the borders of their garments, and love the uppermost places at feasts, and the chief seats in the synagogues, and greetings in the marketplaces, and to be called by men, Rabbi, Rabbi. But be not called Rabbi, for one is your master, even Christ, and all ye are brethren. And call no man your father upon earth, for one is your Father who is in heaven. Neither be ye called masters, for one is your master, even Christ. But he that is greatest among you shall be your servant. And whosoever shall exalt himself shall be abased, and he shall humble himself and shall be exalted. But woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye shut up the kingdom of heaven against men, for ye neither go in yourselves, neither permit them that are entering to go in. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye devour widows' houses, and for pretense make long prayers. Therefore ye shall receive the greater damnation. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye compass sea and land to make one proselyte, and when he is made, ye make him twofold more the child of hell than yourselves. Woe unto you, ye blind guides, who say, whosoever shall swear by the temple, it is nothing. But whosoever shall swear by the gold of the temple, he is a debtor. Ye fools and blind, for which is greater, the gold or the temple that sanctifieth the gold? And whosoever shall swear by the altar, it is nothing. But whosoever sweareth by the gift that is upon it, he is bound. Ye fools and blind, for which is greater, the gift or the altar that sanctifieth the gift? Whosoever therefore shall swear by the altar sweareth by it, and by all things on it. And whosoever shall swear by the temple sweareth by it, and by him that dwelleth in it. And he that shall swear by heaven sweareth by the throne of God, and by him who sitteth on it. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for ye pay tithe and mint and anise and cumin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, justice, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Ye blind guides, who strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye make clean the outside of the cup and of the platter, but within they are full of extortion and excess. Thou blind Pharisee, cleanse first that which is within the cup and platter, that the outside of them may be clean also. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye like with whited sepulchres, which indeed appear beautiful outward, but are within full of dead men's bones, and of all uncleanness. Even so ye also outwardly appear righteous unto men, but within ye are full of hypocrisy and iniquity. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! Because ye build the tombs of the prophets, and garnish the sepulchres of the righteous, and say, if we had been in the days of our fathers, we would not have been partakers with them in the blood of the prophets. Dave, will you pray for us, please? Dave?
Most gracious and all-knowing Father, we do thank you for the day so far, and for all you've done in your goodness.
Amen. Thank you. You may be seated.
Thank you, Steve. That was a lot of reading. I didn't mean to have all the big words in there.
I practiced ahead of time.
You know, it is great to have a church family. Like any church family, or any family, you always have challenges. I can't express expressed to you all enough what you all mean to Robin and I. That's why, as we are transitioning into chapter 2 of Romans, and before we get into Matthew 23, I had all these big plans for Matthew 23, because basically the theme in Matthew 23 is hypocrite. Those that are religious, if you didn't catch that, Jesus makes it a very clear point of the Pharisees, you're a bunch of hypocrites. But before we get to that point, I want to talk to you about something a little bit different. Romans chapter 2, we're transitioning from chapter 1 of God making it very clear of his anger towards sin. Remember, we talked about the fact that God gets angry at sin. That's what wrath is. It is an anger of sin that is driven by his holiness. Not by emotions, not by pride, but by his holiness. He does not tolerate sin. And you're going to hear me repeat this over and over again, because I think we in our culture today have lost that concept of what exactly is God's wrath. We think it as being a punishment, and it's not that. It is God's holiness, and the fact that his holiness will not tolerate any degree of disobedience. Any degree of disobedience. As we transition from chapter 1 to chapter 2, and keep in mind, when Paul wrote this letter, there were no chapters and verses. Paragraphs, but no chapters and verses. And I believe that Paul turned a page and began to, if I may put it in a little bit simpler language, Paul turned a page and was addressing the immorality in people's thinking, their choices, and introduced a devastating phrase when Paul began to say, and God gave them over. 3 times Paul says, and God gave them over. Literally, God abandoned or withdrew the restraining grace in a person's life to where sin would just rule a person's life. Their life would come off the rails as a result of their sin, their passions in their lives. If you ever wonder why people make these insane choices, this is why. I can remember when we were living in South Florida, getting called one night. This was years ago, and counseling at a drug and alcohol rehab program. And I got a call to go to a gentleman's house, and it was probably 1 o'clock in the morning. And I can remember going into the kitchen, and here this man sat, big guy, bigger than Dave. Here this man sat in his kitchen floor with his back up against the island that came out in the middle of the floor, and a 9mm in his hand. And all he could say to me is, I've got nothing left. I have nothing left. And he still had a family, still had a job, but he so refused to give up the drugs that his thinking was insane. And his logic was to kill himself. Long and the short of it was God intervened. He did not. He got help. As far as I know, he's living a life with his family in church and involved with his family. But sin causes us to have insane thinking. Paul talks about it being as fools, to make errors in judgment. But as we transition from chapter 1 to chapter 2, there's something that I believe that we need to, an issue that we need to talk about. And as we talk about this, it will make more sense as we go into chapter 2. You ever had anybody say to you, well, I think I'm going to go to heaven, I'm living a good life, I'm doing everything that I should be doing, and I'm a good person, I'm a spiritual person, I go to church, I'm in the church every Sunday. Well, what's God do with those people? I mean, we read through chapter 1 about God giving them over to their own desires, to their own sins, to living these lives that were very immoral. Well, what's God do? The question is, what does God do with moral people? It's not talked about very much. But what does God do with them? Does God have a different view of sin in the life of a moral person? And the answer to that is no. God has no different view of sin between the immoral and the moral. It's all the same. I can find no difference. And I believe Paul addresses this. Perhaps he didn't write it down, but I can't help but wonder if this question didn't come up. And the reason I wonder about this question is how he starts verse 1 of chapter 2. He says, therefore you are inexcusable, O man. Now there are a lot of scholars that disagree or question who Paul was actually writing about when he's or referring to when he says, "Oh man." Many believe that Paul was writing to the Jewish leaders of his day. And it would make sense because of how we look at his phrasing through chapter 2, and we will look at this briefly today, but then more in depth next week. We will get into more depth of Matthew chapter 23 because I believe it goes along with it. It points out to that self-righteous person, that person that defines themselves by their own energies of righteousness. We would call them a religious person today. I believe one of the most devastating tactics that Satan is using today within bodies of believers, within churches, is this concept that you can be self-righteous. You can do all these things and rely on yourself, do good, be a moral person, and expect to go to heaven. Let me tell you something, friends. There are going to be a lot of moral people spending an eternity in hell. Because it does not line up with God's Word. You look at verse 1 here. It says, you are inexcusable. Oh man, whoever you are who judge, for in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. For you who judge practice the same thing. Now, let's go back for a minute. Let me point a couple of things out to you. Let's just look at this thing of, can I, as a moral person, simply live a moral life, be good, do all the right things, and expect to get to go to heaven? Now, there's a lot of denominations today that teach that. That includes infant baptism. I do not believe personally that infant baptism automatically enrolls you into an eternity in heaven. I'm not going to debate that, but I don't believe that. I don't believe that being able to just live a moral life gets you into heaven. I don't believe in attending church, even if you were able to do it 365 days a year. I don't believe that that would get you into heaven, and here's why. The very first thing that we need to consider about self-righteousness being a flawed thinking is what Jesus said in John 14:6. John 14:6, Jesus says what? I am the way, I am the truth, and I am the life. No man, and you can include no woman or no child, comes to the Father but by me. Now, practically and logically, if we've got to consider the fact that nobody can come to God except by Jesus Christ, that would immediately exclude any efforts on our part to get to heaven. We can't get to heaven by tithing abundantly. Now, please don't misunderstand. If you want to tithe abundantly within this church family, please do so. We can do more of what we did last night. If you want to attend church 365 days a year, I'll make sure that these church doors are open for you to be here and worship. If you want to live a countercultural life and be a moral person, and I say that because to live a moral life is counter to our culture today. I challenge you to argue that point. Nothing in our culture today points to morality. It's very immoral culture that we live in today. But none of these efforts can excuse the truth when Jesus said, for I am the way, I am the truth, I am the life. No man comes to the Father but by me. So Paul writes and he says, you are inexcusable. Now, one of the reasons that he says that, and we'll see this next week when we look at Matthew 23, the Jewish culture and the Jewish leaders of the day believed that the mere fact that they were Jews, they were God's chosen people, they believed because of that they had an automatic ticket into heaven. Many today in westernized Christianity believe they have an automatic ticket into heaven because, well, I grew up in the church. My parents laid the foundation of this church, and I have been in this. You see that brass plaque up there? My family put that brass plaque there. That brass plaque goes to me when I go to heaven. That's my ticket into heaven. Well, I've lived a moral life. I am of the moralist of the morals. That earns me a right into heaven. Which brings me to the next thing. Paul says, you're inexcusable. But then it's important to recognize not only are we inexcusable, but there is nothing that we can do. Salvation is not by us. Ephesians 2:8-9 says what? For by grace are we saved through faith. It is not of ourselves. You might say, well, by whose grace? I give grace to people every day. But it's not your grace that saves us. Paul makes that very clear. For by grace are you saved through faith. It's not of yourself. It is a gift of God. It is God's grace that gets us to heaven. It is God's grace of a gift of righteousness to us. See, God gives us that gift of righteousness. God gives us the gift of His grace, a gift of His faith. It is because of His gift of faith to us that we are able to rely on Him. When we live a life of self-righteousness, we literally reject God's gift of faith and God's gift of grace. We reject it. We throw it away. For by grace are you and I saved through faith. It is a gift of God, not of works, lest any one of us can boast. In other words, God made it very clear. He says, it is because of me. Nothing that you do. There is nothing that you are able to brag about. There is nothing that you are able to do to stand up on a soapbox and point to yourself or pat yourself on the back to say, I did it. Was it Frank Sinatra that did the song, I Did It My Way? Well, you can't do it your way and hope to spend an eternity in glory. There's a third point, and these are not the only 3 points to address that question of what about the moral people? What about all those that live moral lives? There's a third response to that question, and that's found in Titus 3:5 and 6. Titus 3:5 and 6, which had not been written yet when Paul wrote Romans, but I can't help but believe that Paul would have quoted this had it been written. He would have said to the, you are inexcusable, old man. He would have said this, not by works of righteousness, which you have done, but according to His mercy, He saved us. Titus made it very clear. It is not by our efforts, not by our works that gets us into heaven. It is not by our ability that gets us into glory. Now stop and think about this for a minute. We cannot do it on our own because we're not capable of it. You question this, go back to Galatians chapter 5 and verse 16. I got to move a little bit here. It's cramping my style. Galatians chapter 5 and verse 16 makes it very clear. God instructs us to walk by the Spirit. In other words, live our lives being led by the Holy Spirit, and we will not fulfill the lust of the flesh, those natures of our old nature, the natures of our humanity. We can't do it on our own. Paul, I believe, Romans 7, there are scholars that have said that Paul was questioning his salvation when he said, I do the things I ought not do rather than the things my heart desires to do. I believe that Romans 7 is a testimony of Paul's process of spiritual maturity and growth, or sanctification. And you stop and think, well, how in the world would Paul need to continue to grow spiritually? Because Paul still dealt with the challenges of his humanity and his flesh. And he said, for I do the things that I'd rather not do than the things that my heart in loving God really wants to do. And you see, as a result of that, there is nothing we can do to earn our way into heaven. It's not by works of righteousness which we have done. And you stop and think about it. I believe it's in Isaiah that talks about the fact that our